Last week, ousted Honduran leader Manuel Zelaya stepped into his country of Honduras for just a couple of hours before turning back. Now, he's still in Nicaragua, just a few feet from the border, but the crackdown inside Honduras heats up. Coup leaders show few signs of agreeing to any deal, and the crackdown is beginning to remind some of the grimmest times of the old Cold War Contra era. Grandin, author of Fordlandia and a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine, was in Honduras yesterday and joins us now from Guatemala City. He's got a new piece coming out that will appear on the Nation website any day. That's thenation.com. Greg, welcome to the program. Welcome back. Talk about your trip to Honduras. You were there longer, I think, than Zelaya, or were you?
Yeah, no, I was there for a few days, so I was definitely on Honduran soil longer than Mel, as he's known in Honduras. It's interesting. It's the coup leaders and the coup regime have gone to great lengths to paint themselves to the world portray themselves to the world as open and democratic and procedural, arguing that what they did wasn't a coup, that it was upholding the Constitution. But in Honduras, I mean, it's quite clear that in many ways this is a return to some of the same characters and tactics that we saw in the 1980s during the Dirty War in the region. There's an international observation mission just reported that there's been at least 8 deaths or disappearances, at least those ones that could be verified. Some of them showing signs of torture, strangulation. One body turned up on a grave site, a clandestine cemetery that was used by death squads in the 1980s. So it's and many of the characters that are supporting the coup, many of the social groups, very much invoke the 1980s. You have Opus Dei, conservative Catholics, conservative evangelicals, reactionary businessmen, and of course the military sector, and many of the victims are the same victims that we saw in the 1980s: trade unionists, peasant activists, and progressive priests.
Now, you have some of the players returning. You write in your Nation story about a man who played a key role in the Contra Wars, a Billy Joya. Who is he?
Yeah, Fernando, a.k.a. Billy Joya. He was a captain in the infamous Battalion 316, paramilitary unit, a death squad unit responsible for quite a number of deaths and disappearances in the 1980s. It was the one that John Negroponte, and when he was ambassador to Honduras, infamously covered up the actions of, the crimes of. He was in exile for a while in Spain. They were demanding extradition back in the 90s. All of a sudden, he's reappeared as a special advisor for security to the Roberto Michellette government, the coup government. He's appeared at rallies, walking side by side with Michellette on TV as an international analyst, and it's spooking quite a lot of people, particularly activists and trade unionists who know exactly who he is.
You also have written in your piece that these days Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, is kind of being treated like the Moscow of this era. Why? What do you mean?
Well, it's hard to overestimate the way that Venezuela and Hugo Chavez is being used both to deflect attention, both to justify the coup. That is a clear attempt to link Mel Zelaya with Hugo Chavez as a populist lunging for power, but then also deflecting away from the region's real problems, the deep poverty. 40% of Hondurans live on less than $1 a day. Neoliberalism, the economic model promoted by the United States, has been an enormous failure. Crime cartels linked to oligarchic families and linked to the military since the Cold War have really tightened their grip over state institutions. So the problems are deep here. So Chavez and Venezuela serve as a very convenient deflection, and not just in Honduras, I may say. In Guatemala, it's 24. You would think that Chavez was the president of Guatemala. The amount of attention he's given in the newspaper and on TV.
Talk, if you will, then, about the reaction inside Honduras, and I bet there are many different reactions, to the comments of the U.S. Secretary of State this weekend, where she describes Zelaya's attempt to return as a reckless move.
Well, I think there was outrage, obviously, especially among that portion of the population that supports Zelaya, which is considerable. Tegucigalpa, the population is probably split 50-50 pro and anti-Zelaya, but Honduras is more than Tegucigalpa. It's the countryside and where most poor peasants live, and I think that Zelaya has quite a strong base of support there. And there was outrage. I mean, obviously the people perpetuating the violence, the killings, the disappearances, the death threats are not Zelaya, and it's not linked to Zelaya's threat to return or attempt to return. It's linked to the people who the United States has not brought down the full weight of its power against. There's many things the U.S. can do to show its disapproval. It could freeze, for example, the bank accounts of the coup plotters. It could revoke visas. None of these actions would hurt poor people the way that defenders of the coup regime are saying trade sanctions would disproportionately hurt the impoverished.
To go back to, or to bring the last two things together, in your book, Empire's Workshop, you talk about Latin America as being a sort of playing out ground of larger conflicts and larger global tensions. What do you think is playing out in the Honduran situation today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you do see is this resurgence of a lot of the same constituencies of the Central American and the broader American right from the 1980s. You see conservative Christians, you see conservative businessmen, military interests, militarists, anti-communists coming back. You see them linked to new constituencies as well, exiles from Venezuela, the broader Andean region who have been displaced by the rise of the return of the electoral left in those countries. You see them linked to both neoconservatives in the United States, Otto Reich, Roger Noriega, these names that were very much involved in Iran-Contra and the Contra War and the death squads of the 1980s, but also neoliberals. Lanny Davis, advisor to Hillary Clinton, former advisor to Hillary Clinton, has been hired by Honduran business interests to push Washington to recognize the coup government.
So would it be going too far to say, Greg, that a line could perhaps have been drawn in the sand there in Honduras? We're not going to continue to allow the sort of the growth of Chavez-friendly governments coming from the south?
Absolutely. That's exactly how people, local and international, see this.
And if that's the case, do you think that Zelaya himself, you write about him as a character, is up to playing the role that he's kind of getting in all of this?
Well, there's a process, right? The reality of governing in Latin America often reinforces a left-wing bias. Most people kind of keep that bias to themselves and just accommodate themselves to the reality of power. But if you sincerely want to address the issues of poverty and inequality, environmental degradation and political exclusion, you wind up getting pushed to the left. That's what happened with Chavez. Chavez was a social democratic reformer that was more than willing to work with the international financial sector, but just the realities of power and exclusion and racism in Venezuela pushed him in a certain direction. It's certainly what's happening with Mel Zelaya.
All right, Greg, thanks so much for joining us from Guatemala. We'll continue to stay in touch with you. Greg Grandin, professor of history at New York University, is the author most recently of Fordlandia, but also of Empire's Workshop, a history of the Latin American wars. We'll stay in touch. Thanks so much.